Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Welcome to our daily The Hindu analysis. If you're finding our initiatives to be helpful, don't forget to like the video, share your comments, and for more such useful content, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from the text and context page of the online edition of The Hindu. This article examines the office of the governor and illustrates in detail the constitutional debates on the role of the governor and how his position has an impact on center-state relations. Here, the focus of the article is on the misuse of the office of the governor by the ruling parties at the central government to create constitutional challenges in states which are ruled by opposition parties, which represents a serious threat to center-state relations and as well as to the principle of federalism, which happens to be a part of the basic structure of the Indian Constitution. See, the makers of the Indian Constitution envisioned the role of the governor and his office to be a high constitutional institution or an authority to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution and the law. But they never anticipated that this high office would be misused by the government itself to disrupt center-state relations, which has made the office of the governor a very controversial constitutional office. See, under the Indian Constitution, the appointment of the governor, his powers and functions, and everything related to the office of the governor have been covered under Article 153 to Article 162. The Constitution envisions his role to be quite similar to that of the President of India, meaning the office of the governor is expected to function as a nominal authority while the real power would be exercised by the elected government. In fact, in many ways, the duties and role of the governor is quite similar to that of the president, but of course at the level of the state. Just like the president acts as the nominal executive and the head of state of the government of India, the governor also acts as the executive head of state and is expected to function as the nominal head of the state executive. So based on this role that has been defined for the governor in the Constitution, legal and constitutional experts have argued that the governor has been provided a dual role. On one hand, he functions as the constitutional head or as the nominal authority of the state executive, but in his functioning, he is strictly bound by the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, except for a few discretionary powers which have been vested by the Constitution. These discretionary powers are largely limited to a situation where there is a hung assembly in the state or when there is no clear majority following elections. He has also been vested with few other discretionary powers related to president's rule or state emergency. But even while exercising these discretionary powers, the governor is strictly expected to be bound by the spirit and the values of the Constitution. This is where the secondary role of the governor comes up. The governor also functions as a vital link between the union and the state, and while his true role is to facilitate smooth center-state relations, the office has often been misused by the ruling party at the center to destabilize state governments that are ruled by opposition parties, thus leading to the allegation that the governor has essentially become the agent of center. See, this controversy has a lot to do with how the governor is appointed. In the original draft of the Constitution, three different alternatives were considered regarding his appointment. One was a proposal to hold a direct election to the office of the governor, or to provide for the appointment of the governor with a role for the state legislative assembly. These provisions were contained under Article 131 of the draft constitution, which later became Article 155 in the original constitution that was adopted later. The draft also provided a third alternative, which proposed the appointment of the governor directly by the President of India. Under Article 131, the first option was to have an elected governor. But after extensive deliberations on the floor of the Constituent Assembly, the constitution makers realized that if the governor were to be directly elected, then it would create an unnecessary and direct conflict with the elected legislative assembly and the elected government. As Jawaharlal Nehru pointed out, direct elections to the office of the governor would lead to unnecessary conflict with the elected government and would also waste precious energy and money of the state, which could eventually lead to disruptive tendencies in the administration of the state. So most of the constitution makers, including Jawaharlal Nehru and Dr. Ambedkar, supported a nominated governor, but without any direct role for the Legislative Assembly. So finally, the most acceptable proposal was to provide for the appointment of governor directly by the president, who would be acting as per the aid and advice of the Union Council of Ministers. This is how the central government got a direct role in the appointment of governors, and these provisions have been enshrined under Article 155 of the final constitution, which was later adopted by the Constituent Assembly. It is this power of the center to appoint the governor through the president which created the potential for misusing the office of the governor. There are few specific instances in which the misuse of the office of the governor has been noted. 1. When there is a hung assembly in the state. When there is no clear majority after elections, the ruling party at the center has often been seen to be misusing the office of the governor to prevent the formation of state governments by opposition parties. Second, when a state government has been sustaining on weak numbers in the assembly, and if it loses majority, the governor plays a pivotal role in deciding the next course of action. And in this instance as well, extensive misuse of the office of the governor has been noted. These situations eventually lead to the recommendation of President's rule, and quite often it has been accused that the ruling party at the center has misused the office of the governor to topple state governments. The third instance would be with regard to passage of bills in the Legislative Assembly. With regard to providing his assent to a bill which has been passed by the Legislative Assembly, or even when it comes to referring the bill to the President, it has often been seen that the governor has often misused his constitutional office, usually at the behest of the center, which directly erodes the constitutional authority of an elected assembly. So in short, the structure of the office of the governor, especially his appointment and his functions, and the way in which the governor conducts himself, has often led to a major disruption in center-state relations, which threatens the principle of federalism. In fact, during debates in the Constituent Assembly, Dr. Ambedkar had categorically stated that governor under the Constitution has no functions which he can discharge by himself, no functions at all. While he has no functions, he has certain duties to perform. So instead of a powerful governor, what the Constitution actually conceived was a duty-bound governor who exercises his duties strictly as per the principles and the restrictions laid down by the Constitution. Essentially, the functioning of the governor should not disrupt an elected government and an elected assembly. But unfortunately, this constitutional prophecy failed to work from the 1960s itself. Because when the Congress, which was the then ruling party at the center, lost power in several states, it blatantly misused the office of the governor to topple several state governments, thus disrupting constitutional autonomy. And unfortunately, this practice has continued with successive central governments as well, even under the BJP and even under coalition governments. So it is in this context that the writer of the article examines various committees on center-state relations, such as the Sarkaria Commission and the Punchi Commission, and evaluates their recommendations. See, the Sarkaria Commission on Center-State Relations was constituted by the Government of India in 1983. This commission took an extensive look at the office of the governor and provisions related to the governor, and carefully examined how the office of the governor was being misused by the center. So in order to restore the dignity of this office, the Sarkaria Commission recommended that the appointee should be an eminent person in some walk of life, and they should be someone from outside the concerned state so that he or she would not have any personal interests or vested interests to protect. It was this recommendation which led to the practice of governors being appointed from outside states. The Sarkaria Commission even reiterated the views of Jawaharlal Nehru, which was expressed on the floor of the Constituent Assembly. The Commission agreed that it is much better to have a detached figure as a governor who is detached from state's politics, and also recommended a secure term for the governor so that he cannot be removed at the pleasure of the center. It even recommended that governors should not aspire for further appointments, especially in politics, after they retire as governors, and they should not be considered for other high offices after the completion of their term. Because any such option of a future appointment, either in politics or even in constitutional offices, will create an incentive for the governor to be obliged to the center, especially to the ruling party, and to work at the behest of the center. So that would contaminate the purity of this office, and hence the commission recommended a secure fixed term. Even the first ARC, the first Administrative Reforms Commission, which submitted the report in 1966, also dealt extensively on center-state relationships and strongly recommended that once a governor completes his term of 5 years, he or she shall not be made eligible for further appointment as governor. Then even the National Commission of 2000 reiterated the same view with regard to the appointment and term of the governor. The National Commission gave some important recommendations with regard to powers of the governor on a bill. It recommended that a time limit should be stipulated to the governor, preferably 6 months, within which they should give their assent or reserve the bill for consideration of the president. And if the bill passed by the assembly has been reserved for the consideration of the president, then even then there should be a fixed time limit, preferably 3 months, within which the president should take a final decision and either accord his assent or recommend the governor to return the bill back to the state assembly. These recommendations were provided by the National Commission to prevent the misuse of the office of the governor to stall bills at the state level, which was eroding federalism and as well as the constitutional authority of the elected legislative assembly. But unfortunately, most of these recommendations have not been implemented except for a few, thus leading to unnecessary controversies surrounding the office of the governor. The Punchi Commission on Center-State Relations, which was set up in 2007, also undertook a review of the recommendations of the Sarkaria Commission, particularly on the office and the role of the governor, and it reaffirmed and reiterated most of the previous recommendations. The Punchi Commission took a strong stand against the practice of recalling governors by the center, especially when there was a change of government at the center. Because it's a common practice that whenever there is a change of ruling party at the union government, quite often governors are replaced or recalled and new governors are appointed, thus making the governor's office a political appointment. And this practice has cast a shadow of doubt on the very position and office of the governor. In fact, even the Supreme Court had taken a similar stand in the BP Singhal case of 2010, when a constitution bench of the court delivered a judgment declaring that a change in power at the center cannot be a ground to recall the governor or to replace the governor. If such actions are taken, they can be subjected to judicial review. While Sarkaria Commission had recommended that governor's tenure of 5 years can be cut short only sparingly as a rare occurrence, the Punchi Commission on the other hand went one step ahead and recommended that governors should be given a fixed tenure so that the center will not treat governors as their agents. The Punchi Commission wanted to ensure that the term of the governor is not subjected to the pleasure of the central government, which was allowing the ruling parties at the center to remove and replace governors as they wanted. It even proposed an amendment to Article 156 so that there could be a constitutional procedure regarding the removal of the governor. But the failure to implement all these recommendations has led to controversies and even strong allegations that the office of the governor continues to be misused by the central government, which has threatened center-state relations and the federal foundation of the Indian Republic. In this context, it's very important to look at the S.R. Bommai case, in which the Supreme Court delivered a landmark judgment, through which it placed restrictions on the office of the governor and as well as on the powers of the center, especially with regard to imposition of president's rule in states. In this case, the Supreme Court brought such rampant practices to an end. With regard to the immense discretionary powers that the governor enjoyed and the union government enjoyed when it came to imposing president's rule in states. It confined this power only to the breakdown of constitutional machinery in the state, and even the specific instances were outlined by the Supreme Court. This includes a legitimate political crisis in the state, or internal subversion at the state level, or physical breakdown of constitutional machinery, or deliberate non-compliance by the state towards the orders and constitutional directives of the Union. Only under such circumstances the governor could send a report to the president, that is essentially to the center, recommending that the grounds had arisen for the imposition of president's rule in the state as a result of complete breakdown of the constitutional machinery in the state. In order to limit the discretionary power of the governor in submitting the report, and also to limit the discretionary powers of the center in imposing president's rule, the Supreme Court extensively relied upon recommendations of Sarkaria Commission and outlined that while it could be virtually impossible to determine the breakdown of constitutional machinery by the judiciary, and while this matter has to be left to be decided by the governor and the center, and while the subjective satisfaction of the president in imposing president's rule in itself can be seen to be beyond judicial scrutiny, there is no reason why the court shouldn't take up a judicial review of the material and evidence which formed the basis of the governor's report which led to the imposition of president's rule. In the S.R. Bommai case, the Supreme Court placed these restrictions on president's rule and on the powers of the governor and the center, and established the supremacy of judicial review even in the case of governor's report recommending president's rule. Eventually, it even reinstated few state governments in this landmark ruling, and hence, this judgment has serious implications on center-state relations. Through the judgment, the Supreme Court clearly stated that the power of the president to dismiss a state government is not absolute. The president should use this power only after his proclamation of president's rule has been approved by both houses of the parliament. Until then, the president can only suspend the legislative assembly or keep it in suspended animation, and in case the proclamation fails to get approval of both the houses, that is both the houses of the parliament, or if it lapses the deadline of 2 months, then the dismissed government can be revived. Even the legislative assembly, which was kept in suspended animation, can also be reactivated, as per the judgment of the Supreme Court in the S.R. Bommai case. And it clearly established that the proclamation of President's rule under Article 356 is subjected to judicial review. But despite these checks and balances being put in place by the Supreme Court, and despite all the recommendations of various expert committees, the practice of misusing the office of the governor continues till date, and controversies and allegations continue surrounding the appointment of governor, removal of governor, and as well as with regard to the functions and duties of the governor. Now let's look at this editorial from page number 10, which examines the stagflation risk that is being currently faced by the global economy. See, stagflation is a situation where the economy is registering stagnant growth, accompanied with very high inflation and high unemployment rates. Currently, there are two major risk factors for the global economy, which includes the massive disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic cost of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Even as the global economy was slowly recovering from the pandemic, the world was hit with the Omicron variant, and as it led to further restrictions around the world, the IMF had anticipated global growth to stand at just around 4.4% earlier this year. But now the breakout of a full-fledged war in Eastern Europe is going to take a serious hit on these global growth numbers. And apart from affecting growth and economic recovery, it is also leading to rapidly rising inflation around the world. That's primarily because the Russia-Ukraine war has disrupted global supply chains again, just like the pandemic had done a couple of years ago. As we have been discussing over the last few days, maritime trade and global supply chains have been severely hit by the conflict, and an exponential increase in key commodity prices has been noted, which includes agricultural commodities such as wheat, corn, sunflower oil, etc., and as well as industrial metals such as nickel, palladium, and as well as aluminium and other key metals. But more importantly, the exponential rise in global crude oil prices and natural gas prices is posing a grave risk for the global economy. Upon this, the crippling Western economic sanctions targeted at Russia is also disrupting the global financial and banking system and as well as global trade and payments. Yesterday, the United States has decided to shut Russian oil imports, and according to reports, Europe is also contemplating to phase out Russian oil and energy supplies, which has further delivered a huge shock to the oil markets. This has led experts to conclude that Brent crude oil prices might hit $180 to $200 per barrel, which would simply be unprecedented and will definitely lead to devastating economic consequences. There is also the fear that Russia might retaliate against these sanctions by Western countries, and it might shut off oil supplies and energy supplies to European countries, considering that European countries have a critical dependency on Russian supplies. That's the reason why European countries are not shutting out Russian imports. Instead, they are looking to phase it out. See, for example, Russia supplies nearly 40% of Europe's natural gas requirements. It supplies nearly 25% of Europe's oil requirements, and nearly 50% of the coal requirement of Europe is met by Russia. So, without a significant cost, it's not going to be easy for European countries to phase out Russian supplies. Or if Russia decides to use this as a leverage, it is definitely going to lead to more chaos in the global markets, especially in the oil markets and in the prices of key commodities. So, such sudden and exponential increase in prices of key commodities could easily trigger runaway inflation around the world because these high prices will eventually be passed down to the consumers and as well as to businesses and factories around the world. So, the risk of high runaway inflation accompanied with stagnant growth along with high unemployment rates is pushing the global economy towards stagflation, and no country is going to be immune from this impact. India cannot hope to remain insulated from this economic crisis which is unfolding, and the massive rise in commodity prices is definitely going to trigger huge inflation in India as well. According to a RBI research report, which was published a few years back, if global oil prices were to increase by $10 when Brent crude oil was at the level of $65 per barrel, it had anticipated headline inflation in India to rise by 49 basis points, that is by 0.49%. And considering the current and predicted prices of crude oil, and considering the already high levels of inflation in India, which is hovering around 5 to 6%, we could very well witness runaway inflation in the coming months. But if the government decides to shield the consumers from the impact, and if it tries to absorb the rising oil prices through subsidies and through cutting fuel taxes, then it will risk increasing government's fiscal deficit by a very significant margin, which would then have a macroeconomic impact. So the government is left with two risky options. Either it has to cut fuel taxes, which are already very high in India, and risk losing revenue and thereby increase fiscal deficit, or it has to allow the consumers to bear the cost, thus risking high inflation, which could easily push India towards stagflation, as growth in India has stagnated along with high unemployment. So the only way out for India is to quickly take a stand on the Russia-Ukraine conflict and play a key role in global geopolitics to bring this war to an immediate end. As long as the conflict drags, and as long as the economic war between Western countries and Russia continues, global supply chains are going to remain disrupted with very high commodity prices. So India will have to quickly work with the global community to find a diplomatic solution to the conflict, because otherwise, all the other options in front of the government are riskier options. Now let's look at another editorial from page number 10. This article argues that India and China should both take a cue from global currents in geopolitics and immediately work towards reshaping their ties in order to prevent any further escalations of tensions in their bilateral relationship. See, currently, the dominating issue in global geopolitics is the ongoing Cold War rivalry between United States on one side and China and Russia on the other side. And both China and Russia have a similar complaint that the United States is trying to contain them, and by using this as an excuse, they seek to justify their aggressive actions. While it is absolutely true that the US pursues a containment strategy against Russia and China, this cannot be a justification for their respective military aggression. For example, Russia did have genuine concerns about the eastward expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe, and Russia used these concerns as an excuse to invade Ukraine and trigger a major conflict in Eastern Europe. China, on the other hand, also has a similar grievance. China often says that the US is working towards building an Asian NATO for the Indo-Pacific, and China refers to this as the 5432 strategy of the US. This is essentially a reference to four American initiatives that are focused on the Indo Pacific. It includes the Five Eyes Intelligence Initiative between US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. These five countries have come together and set up a global surveillance network, and they actively share intelligence with each other, specifically on the Indo Pacific region and China's military activities in the region. Then we have the quadrilateral diplomatic grouping of four like minded democracies, which includes US, India, Japan, and Australia. Then US has recently launched the AUKUS initiative involving Australia, UK, and US, which is clearly a military initiative under which US and UK have promised nuclear submarine technology to Australia. Then upon this, US is seeking to build strong bilateral military relations with key powers in the Indo-Pacific, and China refers to all these alliances of the US in combination as the 5432 initiative, which is seeking to build a Asian version of the NATO focused on Indo-Pacific to contain China in the region. But what China fails to understand is that the Quad is definitely not a military alliance because India has ensured that Quad doesn't turn into a military grouping. The Five Eyes Intelligence Initiative definitely has a military angle. The AUKUS initiative is clearly a military initiative. The US does build strong bilateral military relations in the Indo-Pacific to corner China. But however, the Quad is definitely not a military alliance because India has ensured that it remains a diplomatic initiative which focuses on several key issues of the Indo-Pacific, including promoting rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific to maintain free and open nature of the Indo-Pacific. But China's perception of the Quad as a military grouping leads China to falsely assume that India has already entered the military club of the US, which has possibly led China to get aggressive against India, thus triggering the border clashes in 2020. As this military standoff continues, the editorial says that it is high time for India-China to realize that such aggressive geopolitics is likely to escalate into bigger conflicts, and particularly the onus is on China to understand that India in the first place has not joined Quad as a military partner, and two, India would also have similar concerns about the China-Pakistan nexus, just like China has concerns about any alliance or partnership between US and India. In this regard, India has taken the right stand and it has not budged under Chinese pressure, and we have continued building close relations with US, Japan, and Australia while seeking an independent foreign policy. So the editorial says that India and China should grab the opportunity that lies ahead to resolve their tensions, and they should correctly read the global currents in geopolitics, particularly with regard to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and how such tensions and aggressive policies leads to bigger wars and conflicts. And in order to avoid a repeat of this between India and China, both countries will have to make use of the meeting that's coming up on the 11th of March, which is looking to take forward the dialogue between military commanders to de-escalate and disengage along the line of actual control. First, he highlights the serious health risks associated with smoking and tobacco consumption and points out that every year, close to 1.35 million Indians lose their lives as a result of cigarette smoking and tobacco consumption. As per studies, this translates to 3,500 deaths every single day, and the healthcare cost of tobacco and cigarette consumers stands at a staggering 1.77 lakh crore rupees, which is roughly 1% of India's GDP. Hence, to discourage and disincentivize smoking and tobacco consumption, the writer is calling upon the government to adopt the right kind of taxation policies in order to make cigarettes and tobacco unaffordable. He's calling for significant tax increases against these products and also blames the government for making cigarettes and tobacco more affordable by falling under the pressure and lobbying tactics of the cigarette companies and tobacco manufacturers. He points out how the government provided for just a nominal increase in cigarette prices of roughly around 5% in the 2020-21 union budget. Such nominal increases are not enough to deter the customers, and a strong deterrence can be built and a disincentive can be created only through significant and substantial increase in taxes against these products. But at the same time, the taxation structure should also be rationalized, and hence is asking the GST Council to immediately act on the issue, to act on a suitable taxation structure that can effectively disincentivize tobacco products while rationalizing and simplifying the tobacco taxation system. Next, we have an article on page number 12 which refers to the Ukraine International Legion, which happens to be a private paramilitary force that has been raised in Ukraine as a mercenary outfit to fight alongside Ukrainian forces against the invading Russian forces. This organization is in news because recently the Ukrainian president gave a call for people around the world to join this army to help Ukraine fight back against Russia. Following this, the Ukrainian government has even set up a website to take registrations from around the world, and it has asked interested candidates to approach the nearest Ukrainian embassy for help, which will further facilitate their visa-free travel to Ukraine to take up arms along with the Ukrainian forces to fight against the Russian invasion. Following this call given by Ukraine, thousands of applications have been received from around the world, and quite alarmingly, around 500 Indians have also volunteered, with one confirmed case of an Indian student from Coimbatore in Tamil Nadu who was studying in Kharkiv has pledged his participation in this legion, and security sources have confirmed that this would be the first case of an Indian joining such a paramilitary mercenary unit to fight on behalf of one country against another country. Now, such an act is considered as illegal in most countries as per a UN convention against mercenary outfits. In the case of India, we have the IPC or the Indian Penal Code, and Chapter 6 of IPC under Section 121 to 130 deals with offences against the Indian state. Under this, there is a provision which prohibits Indians from committing any act of depredation against any other country which happens to be a close partner or a friend of India. So essentially, if an Indian citizen takes up arms against another country which is at peace with India, which has friendly relations and partnership with India, then such an act would be illegal and it will be construed as an offence against the Indian state itself. If an individual is charged under these provisions, then they shall be liable for nearly 7 years of imprisonment along with penalties, and as well as seizure of any property that could be used by the individual to commit this act of depredation against a friendly government. Now, in the case of Russia-Ukraine conflict, both the countries are friendly countries of India, and if an Indian were to join this Ukrainian mercenary outfit to fight against Russia, that would essentially translate to causing depredation against the Russian state, which is a friendly government, and it will allow the Indian authorities to invoke these provisions to punish any such illegal act. In fact, it was the same provision which was used to deal with ISIS recruits, especially the self-radicalized Indian youth who were indoctrinated with Islamic State's ideology online, after which they were trying to travel to Iraq and Syria to fight on behalf of Islamic State. While some of them succeeded in traveling to Iraq and Syria and fighting for ISIS, many were making attempts to make the travel, and most of them were arrested or detained by Indian authorities, and they were charged under these provisions. Now let's take a look at the mains practice questions. The first question: illustrate the constitutional debates on the role of the governor and how the position has fared in center-state relations. The second question: following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the economic cost of the conflict in Eastern Europe threatens to stall the shaky global recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. In this context, examine the risk of global stagflation and measures that need to be taken by India. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be provided in the description box below. I hope this session has been helpful, and if you feel the same, do let us know by liking the video, by sharing your comments, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. So with this, let's conclude today's discussion. Thanks for watching.